Well, there's certainly some people who've been telling him that the war isn't going well. And you saw what happened to Dmitry Kozak a few weeks ago, senior official in the Kremlin, had been there for a long time, and finally Putin forced him out. And your viewers out there, I'd refer them to what I think is a very good article in the Guardian of London today by Piotr Sauer, which talks about a number of people who have been purged from inside the Kremlin in recent weeks. So I think Putin fears that it could happen. Now, of course, by purging those people, has he removed the threat that they will stand up to him and criticize him? At the end of the day, what will make the difference, we could bring all this together, is just how the next 6 months goes, right? Does Russia get a breakthrough in Ukraine? If Russia gets a breakthrough in Ukraine, if all of a sudden Ukraine has to sue for peace and give up more territory, Putin's fine. If he does not make a breakthrough, he doesn't knock Ukraine out by breaking up the energy facilities, if he doesn't break through on the front line, then he's still got that economic pressure. And that, again, would be a question of a combination of officials. For example, the head of the central bank, who's a very impressive bureaucrat, very, very impressive in terms of how she's managed the economy so far. But she told Putin back in 2022 that she could not keep this going indefinitely. And she's still trying to hold on. So would she dare to talk to ministers like the economy minister to say, you've got to tell Putin there's no way forward? Would Belousov, the defense minister, who's an economist, would he dare to say this, right? Certainly Dmitry Medvedev's never going to say that, for reasons we know very well about Dmitry Medvedev, partly because he's not actually, let's say, completely reliable in terms of his thought patterns. It's the one thing I can tell you, and I think we have to be honest here, what Putin has done quite successfully by waging this war is he's decapitated the opposition movement in Russia. We can tell the story of Alexei Navalny. We can debate whether or not Navalny would have been that opposition leader, but Navalny's gone, right? And you've had other leaders that are gone. And while there is an opposition movement inside Russia, there are very brave people who want a different Russia. They do not have the organization right now. They have been suppressed and repressed. It would have to be a move from inside the Kremlin. And at this point, I don't see that happening. Come back to, let's talk next spring. And if they haven't broken through next spring, and if the Russian economy is flatlining, then that'll be a moment when I think we can revise our projections.
As President Donald Trump says that sometimes you have to let them fight until both sides are ready to reach a ceasefire deal. How do you read this statement? What does this mean about Trump's intent, position, and does he feel that he can give Russia another 6 months and then force Putin to settle this war?
No, that's Trump's temper tantrum. Every time he doesn't get the peace deal and the Nobel Peace Prize, and again, largely because Vladimir Putin does not want to go into negotiations. He's like, oh, that's it. I'm going to walk away. I'm going to take my ball and go home, as we used to say in America, and just let him fight it out. We've had that for 9 months. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, said this back in the spring. The reality here is, and let's compare this, in February, there was a serious chance that the Trump administration would walk away completely from Ukraine. Now we're in a position in November where, because of the more responsible people in Washington, there are U.S. military supplies that go to Ukraine via sale to NATO countries. We are in a position where those supplies will include air defenses, where they will include some equipment used on the front line, and where it will include possibly some supplies, rocket systems, for example, to help Ukraine counterattack against the Russians. We are in a position where, as we talked about earlier, the Trump administration has sanctions on Russia now, which could have a significant effect. We're in a position where the Trump administration is providing intelligence to Ukraine, including for attacks inside Russia. we are in a position where, through the rare earth mineral deal, you have a commitment by the Trump administration to a reconstruction and recovery fund in Ukraine. All those things we did not think were not there in February, they're there now. So it's harder for America to walk away from what it's committed to, especially because of this. If you had asked me this several years ago, when Donald Trump was threatening to withdraw from NATO, yeah, that's a really serious situation. Trump is no longer threatening to leave NATO. And we could talk about why in another podcast, but the U.S. is now involved in NATO. The U.S. is now involved in terms of that encouragement of NATO members to increase their spending, their GDP, percentage of GDP on defense. They're involved in planning for NATO's reorganization of defense against Russia. If you walk away from Ukraine now, you're walking away from NATO as well. And I think there are enough people in the United States, not just in his administration, but in Congress and enough Americans who realize you cannot walk away from NATO and European defense. You can't just simply pretend it's all about China, because what Putin has done is he's posed the most serious threat to not just to Ukraine, but to Europe since 1945.
Another interesting information from Ukrainian intelligence, and I think it's also a bit a disturbing fact, that Russia is now training 8th and 9th grade school students to operate drones, especially raising, we can call it a generation built for war. Do you think they are doing this to continue this never-ending war against Ukraine, or they will prepare this young man for a possible war against NATO countries?
It's part of a militarized society. I'm old enough that, I actually grew up. My boyhood was spent in the Cold War. My teenage years and even into my 20s, there was that idea of America, not just the Soviet Union, but America, where the military was this key part, and you might have to fight the communists. And the Soviet Union did the same thing. Won't make this a history lesson, but you all will know very well in Ukraine about the whole history of the organizations, like the Young Pioneers, for example, that children would have these camps and these organizations. And part of that patriotism for the Soviet Union was the idea that you had a great Soviet military that you were part of. So in some ways, this isn't entirely new for Soviet or for Russian culture to do this. But of course, it's happening in Russia at a time when you have this open-ended full-scale invasion, and where the Kremlin will worry, the longer this goes on, is will our young people keep supporting us, or will they want something better, something different? Because, young people may not necessarily want to have to go to war. They may not necessarily want to have to operate drones, even as exciting and as much as it seems like a video game. They may want to simply have a life where they can get a job, have homes, eventually get married, and not have to think about war on a day-in, day-in basis. So what do? When children are young, you teach them the military is a good thing. War, or at least the special military operation, may be a necessary thing. And you make it hands-on. So you don't just tell them about the drones, you get them to carry out the drone warfare, and then you publicize it. And you all will have seen all the photographs. There'll be loads of photographs, all the children. Again, I'll come back to this, and that is, I'll use a Cold War parallel. I saw this, and it was part of Soviet society from 1945 until 1991. You all will know people in Ukraine who are old enough to have been part of that, right? There came one day in the Soviet Union when, for all that military, whether you call it training, indoctrination, propaganda, people got tired of that. And why did they get tired of it in the Soviet Union? Because they wanted food. They wanted enough food on the table. They wanted decent housing. They wanted decent health care. They didn't just want to be fighting in other places. It so happened that Afghanistan was the breaking point probably for the Soviet Union at this point. Will Ukraine be the breaking point for Russia with this type of military economy? Like we talked about it earlier, I don't think it will happen in the near future. But yeah, down the line, at the end of the day, military indoctrination runs into problems and difficulties when the economy runs into problems and difficulties, because people's day-to-day security starts not with a big bad army. It starts with being able to eat and have a roof over their heads.
Do you think now Russians see that this propaganda?
They know it's propaganda. Yeah, the thing about propaganda is that
they will understand that once they understand.
I think so. Look, I think people know it's propaganda, right? I mean, there's, for me, and I teach propaganda, so at least this is my idea on it, is that propaganda isn't lying to people. That's not the way that they see it, that they're lying to it. On the other hand, it's not like complete truth-telling. We know that. Propaganda is like someone who wants to keep power, stay in power, trying to make you think, oh yeah, I'll support that. So people buy into the propaganda, right? They buy into it, so in this case, they buy into the idea of this strong Russian military and this idea of defending Mother Russia and supporting Mother Russia. And they know that it's a story. It's almost at times like a fairy tale. But if you don't believe the story in the fairy tale, then you're on the outside, right? You're on the outside. You're not part of Russia anymore. You're not part of that propaganda. And again, I'll come back to you. Talk to folks in Ukraine who had to endure that and were part of that, right? That there would be some people in Ukraine during the Soviet era who would have bought into that propaganda, but then when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's like, we don't have to buy into it anymore. We don't have to do this. And I think the bigger question here is, beyond the Russian military, is how many Russians still buy into the propaganda about that single leader who has to be the person that they just can't let go of him, right? They will know that the Kremlin has problems. They will know that the economy has problems. But at some point, and I think it's coming up soon, Vladimir Putin will come out and he'll have a State of the Union 3 or 4 hours answering their questions. And he will put out all that propaganda, and this will be a show which is, this is your leader. Don't abandon your leader. And for now, I mean, I know that we all hope that it wouldn't be the case, that Russians would find a better future and get rid of Putin. But for now, I think most Russians, whether or not they like it, that's still the guy that they're tied to.
From your perspective, how could look Russia after Vladimir Putin's rule? And second question would be, would Russia be able to be less militaristic after Putin's rule and after his presidential office, after he leaves the office?
We don't know. We don't know, because very few changes like that are orderly that takes place. I mean, I could probably think of a country like South Africa, which was relatively orderly after the system of apartheid. But if you look at, let me use the parallel of between 89 and 91, in that entire run of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, when the Soviet Union was collapsing, you have this variety of experiences in terms of what happens in terms of this change of power. And, you could talk about it in terms of East Germany, in terms of what was then Czechoslovakia, in terms of Hungary. What made it distinctive in the Soviet Union, if you remember back in 1991, is that you had someone who, at the end was not a militaristic leader. You had Gorbachev. You had someone who was actually working with the international community and with the West. But all of a sudden, the Soviet Union's collapsing. And then there was that period of time in the summer of 91 when we're like, yeah, is it going to be the military and the intelligence services that are going to take over? And there was a real prospect of that. And then Yeltsin emerges from that, right? But even that period in the 90s in post-Soviet Union Russia, it's not a path to democracy. It's not like this this easy way forward. It's fraught with all types of economic and political difficulties. And while there's never a vacuum of power in post-Soviet Russia, there are a lot of maneuvers for power, which means it is not a system which I would say, which is a distinctive break from the Soviet past. Certainly not in the case of Putin. Now, if Putin was to fall from power, it's part of a question of it's how he falls from power. I mean, if, and this is, with respect, I don't think this is going to happen. I don't think Ukraine's going to militarily defeat Russia by going in and, going into Moscow. So you're not talking about that type of fall from power. I think instead what you have is that you have either an embarrassing retreat where Putin has to give up on the idea of conquering Ukraine, and so he's seen to fail, or you have what we've been talking about here, which is that economic erosion of Russia that takes place. Okay, well, who gets rid of him? Is it the military that rises up against him? And we had a coup attempt, the Prigozhin Wagner Group attempt back in 2023, which had support of some military figures in Moscow. That failed. Would it be that type of thing? Would it be the intelligence services that would rise up against one of their own? I mean, Putin came out of the KGB. Would it be some type of mass people's movement that replaced him? If so, who would be the opposition politicians that would be, sort of the figures of that movement that could take over? All those variables you have to work through. I would say to you that, and I'm not a Russian specialist, a detailed Russian specialist. There are other people like Mark Galeotti who I rely on, or Keir Giles, but I would say that my guess here is that what would happen is that one day you would just have this breaking point in the Kremlin where there would be people on the inside of the Kremlin who would say, you've got to go. Vladimir, you've got to step down. Whether or not we force you out or whether you, quote, retire gracefully, you've got to go. But then I think you immediately have a contest for power amongst those people to try to be the next leaders. And they could be civilian, they could be military. I'm sorry, I can't give you a definitive answer here, is because there's not one model for how regimes fall apart. There are different ways they are broken, and there are different ways, there are different things that come in the aftermath, and not all of them, we have to be honest here, not all of them are productive. If Putin goes, you could face even further destruction and damage as Russia falls into chaos.
But do you believe that there could be some people who would be brave enough to tell Vladimir Putin, right, it's high time for you to go, Mr. President, or face some serious consequences?
Well, there's certainly some people who've been telling him that the war isn't going well. And you saw what happened to Dmitry Kozak a few weeks ago. Senior official in the Kremlin, had been there for a long time, and finally Putin forced him out. And your viewers out there, I'd refer them to what I think is a very good article in the Guardian of London today by Piotr Sauer, which talks about a number of people who have been purged from inside the Kremlin in recent weeks. So I think Putin fears that it could happen. Now, of course, by purging those people, has he removed the threat that they will stand up to him and criticize him? At the end of the day, what will make the difference, we could bring all this together, is just how the next 6 months goes, right? Does Russia get a breakthrough in Ukraine? If Russia gets a breakthrough in Ukraine, if all of a sudden Ukraine has to sue for peace and give up more territory, Putin's fine. If he does not make a breakthrough, he doesn't knock Ukraine out by breaking up the energy facilities, if he doesn't break through on the front line, then he's still got that economic pressure. And that, again, would be a question of a combination of officials. For example, the head of the central bank, who's a very impressive bureaucrat, very, very impressive in terms of how she's managed the economy so far. But she told Putin back in 2022 that she could not keep this going indefinitely, and she's still trying to hold on. So would she dare to talk to ministers like the economy minister to say, you've got to tell Putin there's no way forward? Would Belousov, the defense minister, who's an economist, would he dare to say this, right? Certainly Dmitry Medvedev's never going to say that, for reasons we know very well about Dmitry Medvedev, partly because he's not actually, let's say, completely reliable in terms of his thought patterns. So, you know, it's the one thing I can tell you, and I think we have to be honest here. What Putin has done quite successfully by waging this war is he's decapitated the opposition movement in Russia. You know, we can tell the story of Alexei Navalny. We can debate whether or not Navalny would have been that opposition leader, but Navalny's gone, right? And you've had other leaders that are gone. And while there is an opposition movement inside Russia, there are very brave people who want a different Russia. They do not have the organization right now. They have been suppressed and repressed. So it would have to be a move from inside the Kremlin. And at this point, I don't see that happening. Come back to, let's talk next spring. And if they haven't broken through next spring, and if the Russian economy is flatlining, then that'll be a moment when I think we can revise our projections.